March 1930, Asheville, North Carolina. In front of the entrance gate of Biltmore, 300 people are standing. They have paid $2. No one in the family ever planned this. The gate opens anyway, for the first time not for guests, but for strangers. Almost all of the great estates of the Gilded Age disappeared, demolished, sold, handed over to the state. The Vanderbilt palaces in New York, gone. The Newport mansions, museums, or ruins. Biltmore is still owned by the family, not because it was easy, but because in every generation, someone made a decision that most people considered wrong. 3 generations, 3 decisions. Each of them could have turned out differently. When George Vanderbilt died in 1914, his wife Edith inherited the estate. She was 41 years old. Cornelia, their daughter, was 14. The upkeep was impossible. 80 employees, gardens, agriculture, repairs. The fortune was no longer enough. Edith made a first decision. She sold 87,000 acres, the largest part of the land, to the American government, almost for nothing. But it immediately relieved the estate. From this land came the Pisgah National Forest, one of the first national forests in the United States. George had bought the land to show that exhausted soil could grow again. Edith made sure that this would happen even without him. Edith was not a woman who grieved and waited. She had never run the estate alone, but she learned quickly. What she sold with purpose. What she kept with intention. She knew that Biltmore could only survive if it became smaller, not as a surrender, as a decision. Then she sold the weaving and carving workshop that she and George had founded for the children of the employees, and the village at the edge of the property, piece by piece, not out of indifference, out of calculation. She reduced the staff, closed entire wings, lived with Cornelia in a small apartment inside the house that once required 80 people to function. In 1925, Edith married again and moved out. Cornelia was 25, married for a year, mother of a newborn son. She took over. Cornelia had lived in Biltmore for as long as she could remember. She had been born there, in the Louis XV room on the first floor. Her son was born in the same house years later. She and her husband, John Cecil, continued to run the estate. They received guests, managed the agriculture, kept the house livable. In 1928, their second son, William, was born, again in the same room. When the Great Depression arrived in 1929, Asheville became one of the hardest-hit places in the country. Banks collapsed. Tourism collapsed. The city asked Cornelia for help. Biltmore was supposed to attract visitors who would bring money into the region. On March 15, 1930, Biltmore opened for paying visitors for the first time. Admission, $2. Strangers walked through rooms that had been George's most personal project, through his library, his dining hall, his winter gardens. For many in the family, this was unthinkable. There were family members who considered it a betrayal. George's most private place, now accessible for $2 per person. Cornelia saw it differently. The house was no longer George's retreat. It was her home and her problem. And if it was to survive, it had to work. By the summer, almost 40,000 people had come from every American state and from 42 countries. 4 years later, Cornelia divorced. She moved to Europe and never returned. The house remained with John Cecil. He had given up his diplomatic career for Biltmore, the position of first secretary at the British Embassy in Washington, when he married Cornelia. Now the wife was gone, the children in European boarding schools. He stayed anyway, managed the estate until his death in 1954, without a title, without recognition, without much money. In 1942, Biltmore closed to the public. Washington was looking for a safe place for the most valuable artworks in the country, far away from the coasts, far away from possible attacks. Biltmore was remote. The walls were thick. The director of the National Gallery knew Edith personally. It was a quiet decision, no grand announcement, no press. The paintings arrived under armed guard, were cataloged, secured, stored. Biltmore became the quietest gallery in America. By train, under armed guard, 62 paintings and 17 sculptures arrived in Asheville: Rembrandt's, Raphael's, Van Dyck's, the portrait of George Washington. They were stored behind the walls until the danger had passed. The house that George had built for himself was now protecting something that belonged to the whole nation. William Cecil was born in Biltmore in 1928. He grew up on the estate, was educated in England and Switzerland, and studied at Harvard. Afterward, he became a banker at Chase Manhattan, on First in New York, then in Washington. When his father died in 1954, the house was deserted. His older brother George still lived for 2 years in the bachelor's wing. Then he left as well. A manager appointed by the family ran the operations. The house was losing $250,000 a year. Rooms decayed, roofs began to leak, and there was no money for restoration. The losses were covered by the dairy, George's business, which was still profitable. In 1960, William drove to Asheville, not for a visit. He came to stay. The house was in poor condition, rooms that had not been opened in years, wallpaper peeling from the walls, roofs that leaked. William had no plan, only a conviction that a house nobody enters dies, and that Biltmore deserved to live on. At the airport in Charlotte, he met his colleague, David Rockefeller. Rockefeller asked casually, "What are you going to do with the white elephant in Biltmore?" "A white elephant, a possession that costs more than it earns." Cecil replied, "I'm going to turn it into a black one." He wrote advertising texts himself, took photographs for brochures, offered a free recipe booklet from the Biltmore kitchens. Demand became so high that he began charging 1 cent for it. He opened more rooms, lowered the admission price. After 9 years, the first real profit in the history of Biltmore, $16.34. When his mother Cornelia died in 1976, the final division of the inheritance took place. Both sons could choose, the house or the dairy. George the elder chose the dairy. It was profitable, safe, real. William inherited the house. In 1985, George sold the dairy. The market had changed, and the large supermarket chains had taken over. In the same year, William opened a winery in George's old barn. His explanation was simple: a real French chateau has a vineyard. Today, more than 1 million people visit Biltmore each year. The estate is still owned by the family, without government support, without tax advantages. Of the original 125,000 acres, 8,000 remain. The house still stands. George Vanderbilt built more for himself. He did not plan that strangers would walk through his library, that wine would be pressed in his barn, that his forest would belong to an entire nation. And yet the house still stands. Because every time it could have disappeared, someone stayed, and perhaps that was the real condition all along.